The year is 1263. You're standing on a rain-lashed Scottish shore. The horizon darkens, not with storm clouds, but with sails. Thousands of them. Each one creaks with Norse warriors, hardened by centuries of conquest. Their saga would later call this the largest fleet ever to leave Norway. You have no navy, no towering walls, no seasoned army, just farmers, monks, and scattered clansmen gripping whatever tools they can lift. So how could anyone stop this unstoppable tide? Within days it would not be Scotland drowning, but Norway's plans shattering on the rocks. What happened here wasn't just a skirmish. It was the moment an empire cracked. That it all begins with a storm. Imagine standing at the edge of the Firth of Clyde, that wide stretch of sea on Scotland's western coast, watching the horizon darken with sails. Each sail carries men from Norway, a kingdom that for centuries had dominated the North Atlantic. These were the descendants of the raiders and explorers who once struck fear across Europe, the same Norsemen who had built colonies in Iceland, Greenland, and even touched the shores of North America. And now, in the year 1263, their king, Haakon IV of Norway, was leading what chroniclers called the largest fleet ever to leave Norway. Picture it. This wasn't a handful of Viking longships sneaking up a raid. These were massive, oak-built warships, some stretching over 100 feet long. At the head was Haakon's own flagship, described in the sagas as very glistening to look on. It had 37 benches for rowers on each side, enough to move the vessel like a living beast. Its dragon-headed prow, plated in gold, wasn't just decoration, it was intimidation. Every detail announced Norway's wealth, its power, and its intent. For the people of Scotland, seeing this armada must have felt like watching thunder roll in. Only this storm had iron and fire behind it. But why was Norway here at all? To answer that, we need to step back. The Western Isles of Scotland, places like the Hebrides and the Isle of Man, had long been under Norse influence. For generations, Norway had claimed them as part of its empire. Yet the Scottish crown, under King Alexander II and later his son Alexander III, sought to bring those isles under Scottish control. When Alexander III began pressing the island lords to shift allegiance, Haakon saw it as a direct challenge to Norway's authority. So in 1263, he raised the greatest fleet his kingdom had ever seen, not just to raid, but to reassert dominance and crush Scottish resistance once and for all. The sagas describe Haakon's fleet in detail. Lanterns shone from the ships at night, casting golden light across the water. Shields were fastened along the gunwales, gleaming like walls of bronze. Crews of warriors, men trained from youth in rowing, sailing, and fighting, moved with practiced rhythm. To the Scots watching from the shore, these ships were floating fortresses. For context, in medieval Europe, fleets of even 10 or 20 ships were considered formidable. Haakon arrived with hundreds. Chroniclers speak of so many prows that the horizon itself seemed to bristle with dragon heads. To a farmer on the coast, or a monk watching from a monastery tower, it must have felt like the end of the world approaching. And yet, this was no mere raid. Earlier Norse raids on Scotland had been lightning strikes. Hit a village, seize cattle, grab silver, vanish before resistance could gather. But Haakon's 1263 campaign was different. It was a full-scale invasion meant to break Scotland's hold over its western seaboard. If successful, Norway would have cemented itself as the master of the North Atlantic once again. If it failed, the balance of power in the British Isles would tip forever. Imagine the panic spreading inland. Fishermen carrying news along rivers, messengers riding through the glens, monks scratching urgent letters by candlelight. Everywhere the same question echoed. How do you resist this? For the Scots, the answer couldn't be strength at sea. They had no navy to match Haakon's. Nor could they rely on equal numbers. Their hastily raised levies were farmers, hunters, monks, not professional raiders bred on the sea. But what Scotland did have was time, land, and weather. And King Alexander III was about to gamble everything on those. The Norse fleet might have looked unstoppable, but no matter how many ships a king commands, he cannot command the storm. And soon enough, the storm would answer. Now, picture yourself among the defenders. You are not a knight in polished armor. You are a farmer called from your field, your plough still stuck in the soil behind you. In your hands is not a fine sword, but a wooden spear, or perhaps the same axe you once used for chopping timber. Around you stand neighbors, clansmen, monks, fishermen, gathered not because they are soldiers, but because there is no other choice. This is the army of King Alexander III of Scotland. And unlike Haakon's drilled Norsemen, they are not professionals. Scotland in the 13th century had no standing army waiting in barracks. Instead, the crown relied on feudal levies, ordinary men called to arms when danger struck. When the sheriff or laird summoned them, each man came as he was, bringing whatever weapon he could manage, whatever scraps of armor he owned. Some nobles arrived with a handful of trained horsemen, the closest thing Scotland had to knights. Others brought small retinues of retainers, servants and tenants who owed them service in war. But the backbone of Alexander's host was made up of common folk, men who only days earlier had been ploughing fields, herding cattle, or chanting prayers in stone chapels. This was not an army of glittering shields and banners. It was a patchwork, bows carved from local yew, slings loaded with river stones, axes dulled by farm work. Even the so-called soldiers were really just farmers with spears. Against the Norwegians, the contrast could not be sharper. The Norse warriors had been bred for the sea. From boyhood they learned to row, to sail, to fight. Their sagas told of raids and battles. Their very livelihoods depended on skill in war. When they landed in Scotland, they carried chainmail, round shields, and swords forged in iron, equipment far superior to the tools most Scots held. To put it in modern terms, imagine a prizefighter stepping into the ring against a group of townsfolk who've never trained for combat. That was the imbalance. And yet, despite this mismatch, the Scots still gathered. Why? Because they knew the land beneath their feet better than any invader. The men of Ayrshire and the western coast understood which paths were bogged with mud after rain, which ridges offered cover, which valleys funneled riders into choke points. This was their country, its weather, its stones, its tides, and that knowledge was a weapon just as sharp as steel. King Alexander knew he could never match Norway's numbers on the open sea, but he also knew that no fleet, however mighty, could change the Scottish climate or terrain. His gamble was to stall, to drag out the invasion long enough for storms, winter, and hostile ground to weaken Haakon's men. So when Haakon's fleet loomed over the horizon, the Scots did not rush into a hopeless sea battle. Instead, Alexander III ordered his forces to hold back inland, to harass and delay, to wait for nature to tip the scales. This meant that you, standing among the levies, were not expected to defeat the Norse head-on. You were expected to endure, to hold until the storm itself joined the fight. And still, the fear must have been crushing. Look across the field and you see warriors in chainmail, their shields painted bright, their longships landing in steady waves. Look down the line beside you, and you see your own people, shoeless boys, weary monks gripping axes, grey-haired farmers clutching spears. It doesn't feel like an army. It feels like a village dragged to war. And yet, this is where legend begins. Because these men, ordinary and untrained, were about to take their place in one of Scotland's defining stories. What they lacked in armor, they made up for in ground, grit, and the weight of desperation. The Norse had the numbers, the ships, the weapons. The Scots had the land, the storm, and one weapon more, the refusal to break. And soon, that refusal would meet the fury of the sea. The night falls heavy. The horizon darkens, clouds pressing low, the air thick with the kind of silence that makes your skin prickle. Then, with no warning, the storm breaks. Waves rear like walls of black glass, crashing against the proud Norse fleet. The lanterns that only hours before glittered like jewels now swing wild, sputtering, before the rain snuffs them out. A fleet that had been called the largest ever to sail from Norway is suddenly not a vision of power, but a scatter of helpless shapes, tossed by an unseen hand. These were not ordinary ships. They were the heart of King Haakon IV's great campaign. Haakon, one of Norway's longest reigning kings, had ruled since childhood. By 1263, his kingdom stretched from modern Norway through the North Atlantic islands. Orkney, Shetland, the Hebrides, even Iceland and Greenland. His fleet that autumn was meant to remind the world of that reach. But all his might met the fury of the Scottish sea. The Haakon saga Håkonasana, the Norse chronicle of his reign, describes what came as a magic gale, as if fate itself had conjured a storm against them. Anchors dragged like toys across the seabed. Oars snapped under the pressure of waves. Hulls slammed broadside into each other, splintering. Men leapt into the surf, shields raised not against arrows, but against sheets of water. Picture it. You are one of Haakon's warriors. Yesterday, you stood tall on a polished deck beneath a golden dragon prow. Now you are on your knees in the surf, choking on salt, dragging ropes that tear the skin of your hands raw. Your chainmail fills with water, pulling you down. The very armor that made you proud becomes an anchor trying to drown you. This is not the glory sung of in sagas. This is survival, clutching broken planks while the tide drags comrades into the dark. Even those ships that made it to shore arrived wrecked. Crews staggered into Ayrshir's shallows, soaked, disoriented, weapons rusting in the spray. Instead of warriors sweeping onto Scottish beaches in formation, they landed in scattered knots, some still dragging supplies, others too exhausted to even lift their shields. And while they fought the sea, the Scots were watching. This was exactly the gamble of King Alexander III of Scotland. Still only in his early 20s, Alexander knew he could never match Norway at sea. But if he could stall, if he could buy time for autumn storms to roll in, the land itself might strike first. And now, before his men ever lifted a blade, nature had ripped the edge from Norway's mighty fleet. The chronicles on both sides admit the truth. The Book of Plascarden, a Scottish source, claims ships were dashed to pieces on the rocks and strewn along the coast. The Chronicle of Melrose calls it divine judgment. Even the Norse saga, reluctant to admit weakness, concedes that weather, not men, dictated what came next. For a seafaring kingdom whose power depended on mastery of the waves, this was humiliation. But the storm did not kill them all. Hundreds of Norse warriors crawled ashore, drenched, angry, still armed. On the beaches of Largs, they began to regroup. Shields rose, clusters formed. The dragon banners, though torn, still flapped against the wind. And that was when the Scots moved. Farmers with bows appeared on ridges. Slings hissed stones from hidden cover. Monks turned fighters surged with axes. Cavalry swept along the edges of the beach. The Norse had come as an empire of the sea. Now they stood as fragments, scattered in hostile land. The clash was no longer fleet versus fleet. It was survival versus opportunity. The storm had stripped the Norwegians of their great advantage. And in that one night, the balance tipped. But here's the twist. Storms may scatter ships, but they don't decide battles. That part was left to the Scots and the Norse, face to face, on the sodden ground at Largs. And the prize of that ground, a low hill, a mound, that would decide the fate of the entire campaign. Now picture the shoreline clearing after the storm. The sea still claws at wrecked hulls, ropes whip in the spray, and through it all the Norwegians stumble ashore. Some clutch weapons, others drag shattered planks, all of them dripping, unsteady. Before they can regroup, they see movement on the slopes above. The Scots aren't waiting. Archers press forward. Cavalry rides the edges. Infantry pours down paths known since childhood. In that moment, the invaders realize they are no longer a fleet. They are fragments, stranded. The Norse formations split almost by accident. One group presses near the beach, a half circle of shields against the rising advance. Another cluster seizes a low mound inland. To them it may have seemed wise, but the mound is no sanctuary. Whoever holds it commands the fight. Arrows rain down, hooves pound the soil, axes clash. Every heartbeat decides who keeps the mound and who bleeds on it. For the Scots, the mound is the prize. If they split the invaders there, the rest fall like waves against stone. Panic flickers. Retreat begins with Ogmund Crouchdance. His men rush downhill. What seems like a regroup looks like a rout. Confusion spreads. Shouts break the shield wall. A retreat mistaken for collapse, and collapse mistaken for defeat. Haakon himself steps back toward the ships. For a king, even one step backward declares the field unsafe. And yet, Norse resolve flares one last time. They reclaim the mound, banners whipping, armor flashing. But the sting is gone. Each charge is slower, each fall more costly. The Scots hold the ridges, they hold the rhythm. Behind them the tide gnaws closer at the stranded ships. By dusk the field tells its story. The Norse fight not for conquest but for salvage. The mound is soaked, contested, but it belongs to Scotland now. A battle that began in disarray ends in certainty. The Norse lose momentum, and momentum never returns. How could a coastal clash, one that never grew into a great slaughter or sweeping battle, end Norway's command over these waters? That's the question Largs forces you to consider. The fighting itself may have looked small compared to continental wars, just a messy breaking of lines, a scramble up a low mound. But what followed shows how even minor fields can break entire empires. When the Norse withdrew from Ayrshire, their fleet limped north. Ships damaged, supplies ruined by weeks of storms, confidence gone. And then Haakon himself struck down, not by sword, but by illness, worsened in the Orkney Islands. By December, the great King of Norway was dead. His death shattered everything. Without Haakon, the campaign had no driver. His son Magnus lacked both the will and the resources to continue. The army dissolved, the fleet withdrew. What had been a declaration of domination collapsed into silence. The South with Norse called it indecisive, but ships wrecked, banners lowered, a king gone. Everyone knew the truth. Alexander's patience had paid in full. First he stalled with diplomacy, then he avoided open sea, where Norway was strongest. Finally, he let the storm and terrain strike first. 3 years later, the Treaty of Perth closed the conflict. Scotland gained the Hebrides and the Isle of Man. Norway kept Orkney and Shetland. On paper, a compromise. In reality, it marked the end of Norway's empire in the west. For Scotland, Largs became a story of farmers, monks, and clansmen who held the impossible line. For Norway, it was the quiet ending of centuries of power. And for historians, it is proof that even small battles can shift centuries. Victory at Largs wasn't built on brute force. It was built on patience, on storm and soil, on a strategy bold enough to wait. Alexander's gamble worked. He let time and terrain do the cutting, and when the moment came, the Scots struck. From there came the Treaty of Perth. The Hebrides and the Isle of Man passed to Scotland. The Norse shadow over the mainland finally faded. So here's the question. What other moments in history show strategy outlasting brute force? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories where underdogs flip the script against empires, subscribe now. This is history at its most human and its most unpredictable.